history class with Dr. W. As we conclude our discussion of politics in the early republic, we're going to look in this lecture at the election of 1800, which in fact is sometimes known as the Revolution of 1800 because it was such a groundbreaking event. In the last lecture, we concluded with a discussion of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which laid out the initial arguments for what would later come to be known as states' rights arguments in the antebellum period. In hindsight, it seems clear that Jefferson and Madison, who authored those resolutions, never intended to launch anything like secession from the Union, but rather it was intended to, in the modern parlance, to fire up the base of the Republican Party and let them know what kinds of things were at stake in the election of 1800. As Jefferson later commented, "A little patience, and we shall see the reign of witches pass over, their spells dissolve, and the people recovering their true sight, restoring their government to its true principles." In other words, they would see the wisdom in the Republican viewpoint and would vote out the Federalists in the election of 1800, which, as it turns out, is exactly what happened. Now, the Republicans heading into that election were aided certainly by divisions within the Federalist Party, which I've already referenced more than once. This division was between John Adams, who of course was president at that time, and Alexander Hamilton, who remained one of the most prominent Federalists throughout that period and was still a very prominent public voice. The divisions between Adams and Hamilton were highlighted between the continued issue of diplomacy and affairs between the United States and France at that time. And we mentioned in the previous lecture the quasi-war with France and a number of things that created conflict between them. But that conflict ended when Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France in 1799. Bonaparte was eager to launch a war against Britain and Spain and needed the support of the United States, or at least needed to not be at war with a third nation. And so Napoleon sought out a treaty with John Adams that ended the conflict against France. At that point, the division between Hamilton and Adams was brought even more out into the open, because Hamilton had always been a supporter of more of an alliance with Britain, and now it seemed we were resuming an alliance with France. Hamilton published a scathing pamphlet denouncing Adams just as the nation was beginning to turn its attention to the election of 1800. The Republicans, for their part, were unified firmly behind Thomas Jefferson. Now, as we know, this election is going to result in a weird, unprecedented division between the Republican candidates of Jefferson and Burr, but after the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and spearheaded by Thomas Jefferson's leadership, they were unified in their mission to unseat the Federalists. The campaign was the ugliest the nation had seen yet, as both sides really were not shy about openly campaigning for the office, which was a relatively new thing. Without a calming presence like George Washington overseeing the proceedings, both sides felt free to launch insults and attacks at the other in the press. Even Aaron Burr, who was sort of nominally the Republican vice presidential candidate, was attacked by Hamilton, who called him an embryonic Caesar, as those two had clashed numerous times within the realm of New York state politics. The outcome of the presidential election between Jefferson and Adams was fairly close, with Jefferson winning by an electoral margin of 8 votes. However, due to a quirk in the early electoral system, the actual outcome resulted in a tie between Jefferson and his Republican candidate for vice president, Aaron Burr. In a further quirk in the system, the outcome of the election was then thrown to the Federalist-controlled House of Representatives. This resulted in a lengthy and arduous debate. How should the House of Representatives handle this power that was thrust into their midst? Knowing that the Federalists would soon be out of power, the Republicans would have a 65-41 majority in the House after the new House was seated in the new year. And the Republicans would have a majority in the Senate, and so depending on who the Federalist House decided would be in the White House, the Republicans would have potentially enormous control. There was some thought and debate amongst the Federalists that as sort of an act of spite, they should choose Burr over Jefferson. There was also the thought that Burr had proven himself to be much more chameleon-like in his political actions, and that perhaps if they chose Burr, they would have a more favorable outcome for their own policies down the road. In the end, it was at least partly due to Hamilton's urging that they choose Jefferson over Burr. None of the Federalists really supported Jefferson, and obviously Hamilton and Jefferson had been rivals for many years. But Hamilton's hatred of Burr ran much deeper and struck a more personal note. And so Hamilton believed that the principles of Jefferson would prevail. There was also some backroom discussion between Jefferson, Hamilton, and others that if they selected Jefferson, that he would not take a harsh hatchet to many of the Federalist policies that had been enacted over the previous 12 years. In the end, Hamilton was at least partly responsible for convincing one elector, James Bayard from Delaware, to submit an empty ballot after 35 previous ballots had ended in deadlock. So on the 36th ballot, the electors went in favor of Jefferson by a single vote over Burr. The Republican victory in this election was not only lopsided, it was also enduring. The Federalists had lost both houses of Congress and the presidency, and in fact, they would never again come close to electing a Federalist president. They would never regain a majority in either house, and within about a dozen years, the Federalist Party itself had faded from existence and would be replaced by new parties rising at that time. So this election is sometimes also known as the Revolution of 1800 because it marks the first time in American history that the presidency passed, and peacefully we should note, from one party to another. In fact, this was nearly unique in the history of the world, and thus it is truly a revolutionary action to see control of the country passing from one party to another without an outbreak of hostility. And that would establish a precedent that has carried us forward all the way to the present day, where the losing party steps aside peacefully and gracefully, and the new party steps in to take control. Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural address, seemed to extend an olive branch across the political aisle when he said, "We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." Now, historians have hashed over those comments in dozens of different ways, and it seems clear that Jefferson was not completely burying the hatchet between himself and his Federalist rivals. However, he was extending an olive branch of sorts to those Federalists who might have been on the fence to in fact come over and join the Republican side. And over the ensuing several elections, what we see is that the Republican victory becomes even more dug in. Republican majorities in Congress extended to over 70% in the 1802 elections and over 80% in 1804. And as noted, the Federalist Party was on its way to extinction in the aftermath of this Revolution of 1800. In one important way, though, the Federalist legacy endured long past this election and into the decades of the 1800s. A number of Federalist judges remained in place, and of course, judges are lifetime appointments. Especially important was the fact that John Marshall, who was appointed by John Adams as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801, just before leaving office, remained in that position until 1835. And so from the position of the Supreme Court, Marshall and other justices were able to prolong the Federalist impulse and legacy long after the party itself had crumbled in the early decades of the 1800s.